A few weeks ago, one of our newest members remarked in a meeting with me and a longer-term member, "I was surprised you weren't wearing a green stole on this first Sunday of Advent." Indeed, I had put on a blue stole that Sunday, and having been raised Roman Catholic, in the tradition where liturgical colors for each season of the church year was a thing, I was beginning to feel somewhat exposed for my liturgical ineptitude or my liturgical laziness. The other longer-term member that was in the meeting intercepted, "Oh, as you use, we're not all that serious about those kinds of things." The response seemed to suffice. Now, please keep that particular wisdom, practical wisdom, in mind, as I acknowledge that in order for us to fit in several of the religious traditions of this season, last week, Bodhi Day, and engaged Buddhism. Next week, we're doing winter solstice, and on Christmas Eve, you guessed it, Christmas. This particular year, the winter solstice, Christmas, and Hanukkah dates have collided. And so Hanukkah won't actually be celebrated until the evenings of December 18th through the 26th this year. But today, in anticipation of Hanukkah, we are reflecting on some of the universal meanings of Hanukkah, and in particular, a message I believe that resonates in many of our lives, whatever our religious persuasion. Notice I've got like a multicolored stole on today. I've got all the seasons covered. So Hanukkah, as you know, is part history and part story. At different times in the Jewish tradition, the history of the uprising against repression of religious liberty and freedom was emphasized. And at other times, the story of the miracle of Hanukkah was emphasized. Again, both history and story can hold meaning for us. The history, as you know, is based on the revolt of the Maccabees against the rule of the Hellenistic-influenced king who had decreed that all the local religions, including Judaism, be rooted out in his kingdom. If any Jews dared to continue any of their rituals, including the Shabbat, they did so under the penalty of death. So in their place, pagan rituals and sacrifices became the order of the day, not only in shrines throughout the land, but even in the holy temple of the Jews. Some Jews who admired the customs and the cultures of the Greeks followed these new decrees of the ruler. Other Jews were outraged, not only by the decrees, but by their fellow Jews who were cooperating, and it seemed in such a way that they recklessly discarded some of the sacred traditions of the Jewish people. So that's part of the history of Hanukkah, a word which means dedication and honors the rededication of the temple after it was recaptured by the Maccabees. And there's the story of Hanukkah. And as the story goes, you know, when in the process of cleaning out the temple of its debris and preparing for the rededication of the temple, the Jews discovered only one bottle of oil that had not been defiled. And in this bottle was enough oil for only 1 day's lighting. Yet even with that short supply, they decided to proceed. And behold, as the story goes, the lamp continued to burn miraculously for 8 days. As Rabbi Arthur Waskow explains, the single bottle of oil symbolized the last irreducible minimum of spiritual light and creativity within the Jewish people, still there in its worst moments of apathy and idolatry. The ability of that single jar of oil to stay lit for 8 days symbolized how with God's help that tiny amount could unfold into an infinite supply of spiritual riches. So there is meaning for us in both the history and in the story of Hanukkah. We can find meaning in the history of Hanukkah to remind ourselves that even in some of the darkest moments of history, resistance to oppression and spiritual defiance are necessary for us to participate in order for us to participate in the ongoing creation of our world. And I also believe that the story of Hanukkah reminds us to make it an everyday practice to look not just at what is, a single jar of oil, but also what could be. There's a reason that this story continues to be told, because I believe we need this story. We need this reminder. Hanukkah is our reminder, I believe, that we live by both reason and imagination, and that neither alone is enough. So this universal message implicit in the Hanukkah story has led me to call upon some of our members to tell some version of their own experiences of a time when. It could be a time when it seemed that you were not enough and you discovered more than what seemed possible. Or it could be a time when you were overwhelmed by a personal challenge or a particular challenge in our world, but yet you discovered something more than you could have anticipated. Or a time when the reasonable thing may have been to give up hope, to give in to despair, but something else occurred, and you dared to strike new sparks. And so Lois, Eloise, and Judy and I will each be sharing a story related to this universal message. And before each person tells their story, they will light a candle in this menorah to symbolize that within our lives there can be more light, more hope, more possibility than reasonableness may cause us to see. And we honor that something more by lighting a candle. Lois.
Thank you, Larry, for this invitation. Increasingly, over the last few years, I have felt frustrated by what felt like an inability to have any impact on the growing problems in our world. But I've had two experiences recently that have reinforced, however tiny the light of my contribution is, if I keep shining, it can have some impact. In November, I joined a group that wrote postcards to folks in Georgia, reminding them to vote. But I wondered if those postcards really had any effect. When I heard that Senator Warnock won the referendum, I felt like just maybe someone who had read my card was motivated to vote, and along with the contribution of many others, enough light shined to make it happen in a state that traditionally had been red. Boy, did I cheer when I heard those results. That was great, but the second experience was so significant, it still has me feeling emotional, so I'll ask for your understanding here. A few weeks ago, Chaplain Reverend Dr. Chris Antal came to our church and spoke about the moral pain that veterans experience as a result of what we all require them to do in the service of our country. As you can see, I was very moved, as I'm sure many of you are. I decided to respond to the invitation that Chris extended to participate in a healing ceremony that was held this past Thursday at the Veterans Hospital in Philadelphia. I didn't know what to expect. I was motivated to learn how our congregation might take action to address the moral pain of veterans here in our community. I also hoped that my presence at the ceremony might, in some small way, demonstrate support and ease someone's pain. Veterans and non-military attendees like me had an opportunity to name and light a candle in remembrance of a veteran they were thinking of. But the ceremony also included a caring circle in which we, as citizens, formed a circle around the veterans and laid a hand on their shoulders to communicate our acceptance of responsibility for the pain that they experience, as well as to show them support that they're not alone in their healing process. As I stood behind and reached out, I wondered how much my hand resting on this young man's shoulder would really mean, until I felt him reach out around and put his hand on mine. I could feel his shoulders moving and see his head bob with silent crying. It made me very glad I went that day. We were given one of those candles to take with us, and I keep it lit at home to remind me that my light could possibly be a beacon just when the darkness seems overwhelming. I'm reminded that however my small light might be, it can drive away some of the darkness. I'll never know if any of my postcards actually got read and motivated somebody to vote. I'll never know what my attendance at that healing ceremony meant to the veterans there. I'll never know what my participation in Ilya will result in for some young person. But I can tell you, that soldier's hand on mine will always come to mind when the darkness seems overwhelming. It whispers to me that this little light of mine, I'm going to let it shine, let it shine, let it shine, and hope that it leads to many hands I may or may not ever feel, but hope, feel comfort and support.
Thank you, Lois and Eloise.
Thank you, Lois. Well, I'm a nervous wreck, so bear with me. I had to write it all down. It's good to see you all. It is an honor to be here, to be able to speak for these few minutes. Albert Camus said, "Without beauty, love, or danger, it would almost be easy to live." I'm going to travel in a time machine with you to 1963. At that moment in time, all, including my life, was nearly lost. I just turned 20, 1 month from graduating college, if I could pass the swim test, mandatory test, that I had frequently failed. The swim test. Early one morning, driving on the highway to my student teaching school, the brakes of the car, then the steering, failed. I crashed into New York traffic on the highway, crossing the grassy divider. The windshield glass broke into my eyes, but I heard a voice say, "Help is coming." Fortunately, the hospital was a few hundred feet away. The ambulance personnel extracted me from the demolished car. In the hospital, visitors came, doctors, nurses, in intensive care eased my pain as I lay in critical condition. Another student teacher at the school from a different college came. And for the next 5 years, we had both been hired to come in September to teach. For the next 5 years, she drove me to and from the school. A doctor's note, waived the swim test. And I graduated. In my first year of teaching 8th grade, I believed every student could do better than he or she or anyone could expect. In 1968, 5 years, as I packed my desk to leave full-time teaching for the birth of my first child, the door opened, and a young man just graduating the high school next door entered. He had been a student in my first year. He was in what was called a slow-tracked class, where young teens were not expected to achieve. He came to say, "You changed my life." What survived in 1963 was only the beginning. Strangers and friends with goodwill gave grace, hope, and caring. Albert Camus said, "Real generosity toward the future lies in giving all in the present." Thank you.
So thank you, Eloise. Judy.
I asked for a telephone book, but we didn't have them anymore. So can you hear me? Okay. Again, like everyone else, I am grateful to be invited this morning. Let there be light. 4 years ago, at the beginning of May 2018, I received an early morning telephone call that I was no longer in remission. My lymphoma was back. I made an appointment for 2 days later with my oncologist, but I didn't make it. Instead, I ended up in the ER 24 hours. Couldn't breathe. The lymphoma was causing pressure on my lungs. After draining a quart of fluid from my body at my left lung, I was admitted to the hospital where my doctor strongly advised that I should begin chemo immediately, sort of do it or die. So I did. But the chemo did not go well. I spiked a fever of 103, needed oxygen again, and was delirious. Then I got something called the rigors, which means that all the muscles and tendons in your body spasm simultaneously. I was actually bouncing off the bed until the nurse got into the bed to hold me down until the doctor administered the antidote, which knocked me out. Thank God. I spent a couple of more days recovering, and then a few days after that, I woke up in the morning with fiery pain in my mouth. And I asked the nurse if I had thrush, because that's not uncommon to get with chemotherapy. She checked my mouth and said, no, and called an infectious disease specialist. He took some samples and some blood. He returned 2 days later with several pages from a medical journal explaining my problem. I had an overgrowth of H. pylori. Now, some H. pylori is really good for a healthy gut, but apparently not in the massive amounts that I had. And then he explained that new research revealed that H. pylori was now a cause of lymphoma. So I would begin a purge to wipe out the bacteria and continue it for 10 days after I left the hospital. And now I was glancing down the papers that he had given me as he started to walk out. And I started to shake and cry. And the doctor turned around and said, "Are you all right?" And I said, "Well, yes, but it says here that H. pylori is now correlated with another disease, TTP, the disease my daughter died of." I didn't know how to think about that. It took my breath away. Several days later, I left the hospital with a prescription of 6 different medications to take for the next 10 days to kill the H. pylori. The purge was beautiful. It was brutal. I lost a lot of weight, and I lost my vision for part of one day until they could adjust the medications. By the way, this was going on when I was home alone. But by the 8th day, I was seeing the light at the end of the tunnel, I thought, and then the gut pain and the bleeding got worse. So, back I went to the ER. My son and daughter-in-law spent the night with me waiting for the test results. Early the next morning, we were told that I had salmonella poisoning. Once again, I was admitted to the hospital, this time to the infectious disease ward. As the nurse, gowned in what we now know as full COVID regalia, was helping me into bed, I looked up at a whiteboard. And they have a whiteboard in most hospital rooms now, tells you the date, the time, and usually the staff that's going to be working on you. Now, with all this commotion and sickness, I was losing track of time. But I realized I was going to be in the hospital on Memorial Day, and I started to shake and cry again. The nurse asked me if I was in pain, and I said, well, yes, but not the way she thought. And I explained that I would be in the hospital over Memorial Day weekend. And that was going to be unbearable because my daughter had died in that hospital 14 years before, and that my first grandchild had died in that same weekend, Memorial Day, 5 years later. The nurse, her name was Carol, sat down with me on the bed, cradled me in her arms as if I were her child, holding me to her breast, and began to sing in an amazing contralto voice, Lord God Almighty, have mercy on your wounded children. I could feel the music in her body and my being. As her voice reverberated in the room, I felt that she was rocking me and singing me back to life. I made it through and left the hospital on June 1st, the day my daughter died, 14 years before. I went home to my son and daughter-in-law's house to recover. They were wonderful and kind and overwhelmed. Family caregiving is a nearly impossible job. Most of you know that. And I still had 7 more months of chemo to go. I was exhausted and weak and afraid, and I was afraid it was impossible. So I called church, you, and asked for help. And for the next months, through the next year, people volunteered to drive me back and forth to my cancer treatments, up and down 95 to Christiana, and sometimes to Penn. My family, my friends, this church showed up for me in one of the darkest times of my life. This holy day celebrates a miracle, the light of possibility in impossible situations. While I don't believe in miracles, I know I experienced a kind of miracle. The miracle of everyday, simple human kindness. Everyday, simple human kindness. We can't make the pain, sorrow, and losses we all suffer disappear, not for ourselves and not for others. No magic wands. But we can light the way out of darkness with everyday compassion and kindness for ourselves and for each other. And because we are all wounded children, we all need mercy and kindness. Let there be light.
So thank you, Lois, Eloise, and Judy. I suspect that your stories elicit in us also memories of times when we recognize that beyond reasonableness there was a hope. Beyond the place where we felt we had reached the end, we found sometimes a new beginning. So what I'd like to do is for us to pause as we conclude this service and think about a time when there would have been reasonable reasons that would have led you to despair or to give up, but you persisted anyway. Can you think of a time like that? Or a time when you discovered more than what would seem possible? Take a moment to think of your own story and give me a nod if you thought of something that fits that description. I'm going to ask Lois if you won't mind to light some candles in recognition of those nods. Maybe you'll find a way to share your own story with someone in this congregation today or in the coming weeks. May these stories continue to illuminate hope within us and among us. May we open ourselves to a relentless imagination and an openness to possibility, not for these holidays alone, but for every day that we need them. As Rabbi David Aaron reminds us, we are to fill our eyes with the light of Hanukkah so that when Hanukkah is over, we will continue to see our lives in this special light. So may it be.